Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my May wrap up. There's a few books that I won't be discussing here because I will be talking about them in my review and rankings video for the BookTube prize, but they are My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa Anappara, and The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickels. Should you wish to hear my thoughts on that, then do go over to that review and rankings video when it is uploaded. Which, quite honestly, doesn't leave me a lot to talk about because a few of these books I have actually already mentioned in the two reading vlogs that I did this month. Firstly, we have In a Summer Season by Elizabeth Taylor. This story begins with Kate visiting her mother-in-law, and you discover that she has married Dermot, who is a young man closer in age to her children. He is described as something of a dreamer. He is spending Kate's money and acting like he's rich, but he doesn't have a job and he has nothing to show for it. And throughout the novel, you get the idea that Kate recognises that she shouldn't be with this man, that she has made a mistake that was perhaps fuelled by the grief she felt for the loss of her previous husband. But she also wanted a father figure for her children, even though she doesn't think she's got that. She's just given herself another child. Then a former friend of hers comes back into her life. The relationships in this novel begin to break apart and we get to see the fault lines, basically. What I liked about this story is that every single character had their own journey and that we got to see them presented. However, I do think that the length of the novel sometimes was somewhat to its detriment. I think that if it had been a little bit longer, Elizabeth Taylor could have fully explored the repercussions of a final scene. However, there was an inevitability to this prose that I discussed in my vlog as to whether, because something's inevitable, is that an issue if you as the reader can see what's happening, if the writing is good, or whether we just have to accept that what Elizabeth Taylor is doing here is telling a story that ultimately we all recognise, but it doesn't stop it from being any less tragic. One of the things that I really adore about this writer is her prose and her way of crafting a narrative and how the descriptions lend themselves to the atmosphere which lends itself to the telling of the tale. And sometimes you can have a really beautiful description, but it's what's in between the lines, and there is a great amount of subtext in Elizabeth Taylor's novels which I adore. Where I think she's hard done by is these covers by the Virago Modern Classics, because they give this idea that you're getting a very light, summery read, and it doesn't do anything to show the darkness and oppression that often features within her stories. And when I say oppression, I mean the oppressive atmosphere, how tradition is really ruining the lives of these characters. At the same time, I wonder whether Elizabeth Taylor doesn't actually long for those days where tradition was sought after and where there was a very clear definition between the rich and the poor, and whether she doesn't like the muddying of the waters and the idea that people are able to rise above their station. It would be interesting for me to go and look back at the life of Elizabeth Taylor so that I could apply some context to these novels. Either way, I do enjoy them for what they are. It always feels a bit like Agatha Christie minus the mystery, but all of the darkness. I just discovered that wasn't the first book I read this month. I also read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark first. Muriel Spark is a writer who I think I will go to whenever I want something light and funny to read. I often think that her books can immediately be turned into scripts, but I do sometimes wonder what the fuss is about and why folk recommend her so heavily. I enjoy the comedy, I enjoy the way that these books often feel like a moment in time. Similarly, I read The Ballad of Peckham this month, and something that Muriel Spark always does is gives the reader a very good sense of setting and character. Oftentimes I wonder whether she's just exploring the same sorts of themes over and over again. In The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, we have this character of Jean Brodie who is always talking about how she's in the prime of her life, and from the outset we know that one of her students did something that caused her downfall and caused her expulsion from the school she was teaching at. But the children and the girls are very much dedicated to her. I suppose there could be a case of maybe discussing allegory here and discussing the allegory of society, how we always expect girls and women in particular to behave in one way, and we want to educate them to be that one person and that stereotype. And in the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, she's perhaps teaching them differently and teaching them to challenge those views by teaching them things that they aren't supposed to know. In the Ballad of Peckham, we have something similar with this character of Dougal Douglas, who ends up working at this factory. And what I think Muriel Spark always does is she uses a particular setting as an allegory for society. In The Abyss of Crewe, we had the Abbey. In the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, we had the school, and here we have the factory. And what she's always doing is sort of the cat amongst the pigeons type thing of thrusting a character in there who doesn't fit and having them slowly worm their way into people's lives and cause unrest and cause the system to break down and reshape itself, and people to examine who they are as well. There is a dark humour there that I appreciate. I really do like Muriel Spark's dialogue, but I do look forward to reading more of her works in future. Next, I'll move on and talk about Fludd by Hilary Mantel. Similar to the other books that I've mentioned here, this is another character entering into a situation and tearing it down. And here we have Fludd, who basically, we have a small town in the north of England that isn't really worshipping Christ the way they're meant to. We have pagan statues that the bishop wants torn down and buried so that people know they're supposed to worship Christ. They're not supposed to worship all these different pagan saints and deities that they've just pulled out of nowhere. And Fludd arrives and he gets the vicar to admit that he no longer believes in God, and he begins something of a relationship with a nun there. And slowly Fludd, as with the Muriel Spark book, as with the Elizabeth Taylor, worms his way into people's lives. Throughout the book you have the question of whether this man is actually the devil drawing people to temptation, or whether he is just a man who helps people to recognise their wants and their needs. I was reminded of The Master and Margarita with this book, and I do think that it works well as a companion. I don't know whether Hilary Mantel was informed by that novel. There is very little mention of anything related to that book, but I kept getting hints towards it. Hilary Mantel often plays with the supernatural, and she does the same here. I was really grateful to see it. I like the way it's just there, and as a reader you have to accept it. What I really enjoyed was towards the end of this book, Mantel starts describing Manchester, and the way she does it. This book is 32 years old, and it still felt so much like the Manchester that I have seen from how it was described, and I really liked that evocation here. Which brings me to the final book that I'm going to be talking about in this video, and that is Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. And I believe that this is a seminal gay text. I feel like I heard about this book from Leo of A Little Book Life. I had no idea what I was getting into when I started reading this book. I'm still not sure that I properly understand what was going on in this book, or why it is so important to so many people. I will have to go and do some more research surrounding this book. But we begin with letters between friends, and one of these friends reveals that they have written a novel based on the lives that they led in New York, specifically Fire Island, at a certain time. We then have the novel presented to us, and we're told at the beginning that names haven't been changed because these characters were so prolific there was no need. And each chapter is told from a different character's perspective to create an entire narrative. Through doing this, it creates something of a choral voice really, and this sense of reporting how these characters behaved. It also kind of makes allowances for any time there might be a bit of change in the narratorial voice. It's one of those books where I liked the writing and I thought there were some excellent descriptions in here. However, at the same time, it felt a bit repetitive and it felt a bit like nothing happened. I don't really know whether the characters were on a journey, but then at the same time, it's rather interesting to look at these characters when you think about classic pairs. So we have Malone, and I think the other character's name was Sutherland. And Sutherland is very much presented as more of a feminine archetype of a homosexual man, whereas Malone begins very much straight-laced, one of the suits. And when you think about it, it really does fit into this narrative that we've often perpetuated of the straight man in comedy and the more comedic figure who is a bit of a caricature. I know I mentioned comedy here. This book isn't really a comedy, though there are some funny lines throughout. And as an examination of a city at a time and a revelation as to what lives were like, I do believe that this book works quite well. We've all read books where we just wanted more. And this is a case where I don't actually know what more is, but I know that I wasn't left satisfied by this book. I very much felt like it was a book going through the motions and then it just ended. Maybe there's a case for going back and rereading it to see whether I missed something. I can't say as I think it was presented in the best possible fashion, but I think at the time this book was released, for the topics it was discussing and the way it discussed them, I can understand why this book was such a classic and made such a mark. But if anyone else has read this book and can supply me with some context and some idea behind it, then I would be most appreciative indeed. And them's the books. As I say, I also read 3 other books for the Booktube prize, but I will be discussing them in my review and rankings video. If you have read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.